The scrapyard was a desolate place, filled with the wreckage of forgotten machines and rusted vehicles. Leo, a skilled mechanic, made his living here, salvaging what he could from the remnants of technology left behind after the war. Earth had changed, and so had he. The world was no longer the place it used to be. War had ravaged much of the land, and humanity was struggling to rebuild. Leo, however, had found his peace among the junk. His workshop was small but well-equipped, filled with tools and parts from machines of all kinds. He didn't need much, just his hands and his knowledge to repair things that others had discarded. One evening, while scavenging through an abandoned research facility, Leo came across something that would change his life forever. It was a body, unlike anything he had ever seen. At first, he thought it was a piece of scrap metal, but as he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. Sort of. The body was humanoid, with sleek, metallic skin, and a design so intricate that Leo could tell immediately it was far beyond anything humans had created. She was a robot, but she was no ordinary machine. Her frame was beautifully crafted, with smooth curves and powerful limbs, designed for strength and agility. Yet, she lay broken, her body damaged beyond repair. Parts of her were missing, and the remnants of her head were cracked open, wires spilling out like spilled wires from a broken machine. Leo's curiosity got the better of him. He knew how to fix things, and this was no different, or so he thought. The challenge of bringing this advanced technology back to life intrigued him. The body of the robot was covered in deep scratches and scorch marks, a sign that she had seen violence, maybe even battle. Her clothes, tattered and torn, were of alien make, unlike anything Leo had ever seen. Taking a deep breath, Leo carefully scooped her up into his arms. She was heavier than she looked, but his strength and determination kept him going. He was no stranger to repairing machinery, but this felt different. This wasn't just another broken machine. This was something more. As he made his way back to his workshop, Leo couldn't help but wonder who or what this robot had been. Her sleek design suggested she had been built for something important. But what? The markings on her body hinted that she was not from Earth, not from his world. She was something far more complex than anything he could imagine. He gently laid her on the workbench in his small workshop, his mind racing with possibilities. The damage was severe, but he was confident that with the right parts and a lot of patience, he could fix her. But as he looked down at her, he realized that there was more to this than just repairs. This robot had a story, one that Leo might never fully understand, but he was determined to find out. With the soft hum of his tools in the background, Leo began to work on her, his fingers expertly tracing the wires and circuits. He didn't know it yet, but this broken machine would change his life in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Leo had worked for days without rest, trying to piece together the damaged robot. Every time he thought he had solved one problem, another would arise. Yet something about the task kept him going. There was a strange pull in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, as if this machine was meant for something more than just being repaired. His workshop was cluttered with tools and wires, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. Leo's hands moved with practiced ease as he connected wires and adjusted circuits. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was as if the robot was somehow aware of his every movement, even though she was still lifeless on the table. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, Leo felt a sense of triumph. He had connected the last wire, placed the final piece into place. Taking a step back, he wiped the sweat from his brow and stared at the robot. Her body was now fully repaired, her once cracked and damaged metal shining like new. But there was still no sign of life. Leo sighed and sat back, running a hand through his hair. He had done everything right. What was missing? He couldn't explain it, but something deep within him made him try one last thing. He reached out and gently pressed a button on the robot's chest. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, with a soft whirring sound, her eyes flickered open. At first, she blinked slowly, as if struggling to focus. Leo stood frozen, watching in awe. Her eyes, a deep, vibrant blue, stared up at him. They weren't just mechanical. There was a depth to them, a spark of life that made her seem almost human. She wasn't just a machine anymore. "Whoa, where am I?" Her voice was soft and raspy, barely a whisper at first. It was the sound of something lost, searching for its purpose. Leo's heart raced. He hadn't expected her to speak, let alone move. "You're in my workshop," he replied, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. "You were damaged, but I fixed you." The robot blinked again, her eyes searching the room as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. She slowly raised one hand, examining her metallic fingers, flexing them as if testing their functionality. She seemed confused, disoriented. "Who am I?" she asked, her voice still soft, but now tinged with fear. It was clear she had no memory of who she was or where she came from. Leo hesitated. This wasn't just about fixing machines anymore. This was about understanding who or what she truly was. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to help you figure it out." The robot's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and vulnerability. She was more than just circuits and metal now. She was something real, something alive. Leo realized that he had not just repaired a machine. He had brought a being back to life. As the robot sat up, taking in her surroundings, Leo watched her closely, unsure of what would come next. But one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. The robot had awoken, and whatever path she would take from here, Leo would be by her side. But her journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it had just begun. The robot, though Leo still didn't know what to call her, sat up fully, her movements slow but purposeful. Her eyes scanned the room, then fell to the ground, where the remnants of her broken body had been scattered before Leo repaired her. There was a long pause as she looked at the scattered parts of herself. It was clear she was trying to understand what had happened to her, why she was here, and who she was before. Leo remained standing near the workbench, watching her quietly. He knew this moment was important. The robot wasn't just a machine to be fixed and left. There was something deeper at play here, something beyond the mechanics. "Do you remember anything?" Leo asked softly. His voice carried an edge of curiosity, and maybe even concern, but he wasn't sure why. The robot, no, the woman, looked up at him. Her eyes were full of questions, but she could not answer him. The confusion in her gaze was evident, but she did not seem scared. Instead, there was a sense of calm in her posture, as if something inside her recognized him, even if her memories did not. She paused, her voice hesitant, as if each word she spoke required effort. "I don't know." She looked at her hands again, trying to make sense of the reality she was now in. "I was in pain." Her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, Leo saw a glimmer of emotion, vulnerability. "I felt like I was breaking." Leo's heart softened. She had been through something terrible, he could tell, but she wasn't broken anymore. She had been brought back, fixed by his hands, piece by piece. It felt surreal that just days ago, she had been nothing more than a wreck, and now here she was, sitting and talking. Alive. "You're not broken anymore," Leo said gently. He took a step forward, then paused. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, eyes searching his face, as if trying to read him. Her gaze lingered for a long moment, then shifted to her body again, as if trying to understand how it had come together so perfectly. "How?" she whispered. Leo smiled faintly. "I'm a mechanic. It's what I do. I fix things." "Fix things," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was broken, lost, and you fixed me." The way she spoke made it seem as if she were trying to understand her existence all over again. Leo couldn't help but feel a strange bond with her. He had fixed more machines than he could count, but this This felt different. She wasn't just another project. She was a living being now. Her silence was a reminder of how much more there was to learn about her. "Do you know where you came from? Who you were before?" Leo asked, his curiosity growing. He had to know more. But the robot didn't answer immediately. Instead, her expression grew distant, as if she were trying to recall something important, but it kept slipping away. She pressed her hand to her forehead, her fingers trembling slightly as she closed her eyes. I don't know," she said, her voice small, filled with a hint of sadness. "I don't remember." Leo knelt beside her, his face softening with sympathy. "It's okay. You don't have to remember everything right now. We'll figure it out. Together." Her eyes met his again, this time with a flicker of gratitude. She was no longer just a broken machine. She was something far more complex, more human than Leo could have ever imagined. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would help her find her past, and whatever future she chose, he would be there to help her through it. Leo extended his hand to her gently. "Come on, let's get you up. You're safe here." The robot, no, the woman, nodded, taking his hand, and as she stood, it felt as though something had shifted. They were no longer just two beings in a workshop. They were two souls with a shared journey ahead, a journey of discovery. The next few days were filled with small, quiet moments of discovery. Leah watched as the woman slowly adapted to her new life. She had been a machine, robotic, cold, and emotionless. Yet now, she was beginning to show signs of something deeper, something that felt human. Her movements had become more fluid, less mechanical, as if she was learning to live in a way she had never done before. She had started calling herself Lyra, a name that seemed to fit her somehow. It was as if it had been with her all along, waiting for her to remember. Leo didn't question it. There was something in the way she said it, in the calmness of her voice, that made it feel right. Every evening, Leo would sit with her in the workshop, showing her small things, books, videos, and even old photographs of Earth, the world he came from. Lyra was fascinated by it all, her curiosity growing with each new thing. But despite her eagerness to learn, there was a constant shadow over her, a sense of loss. The question that always lingered was the same. Who had she been before all of this? Leo knew she was struggling with it. The past was like a fog she couldn't get through, and the more she tried to grasp it, the more it seemed to slip away. He had no answers, but he couldn't just sit by and watch her suffer in silence. One evening, after a long day of learning in silence, Leo decided to take a different approach. "Lyra, do you want to go outside?" he asked. His voice was gentle, trying to offer her something different, something freeing. She looked up at him, her bright blue eyes filled with a flicker of uncertainty. "Outside?" she asked, her voice a little hesitant. "Yeah," Leo replied. "There's a park not far from here. It's quiet. You might like it." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll go with you." Leo smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They walked through the quiet streets of the small town that Leo called home, the air cool and fresh. As they approached the park, Leo could see the tension in Lyra's shoulders, the way she held herself as if still unsure of her place in the world. He could relate. She was out of place, out of time, out of context, but maybe, just maybe, nature could offer her a little peace. The park was a haven of green, with tall trees casting long shadows in the evening light. There were few people around, just a couple of families enjoying the sunset. Lyra's eyes widened as they entered. It was a world she had never known, a world full of life and simple beauty. Lyra took a few tentative steps forward, her eyes scanning the surroundings with awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Leo watched her, his heart heavy with emotion. It wasn't just the park, or the sight of nature. It was the realization that she was experiencing something new, something untouched by her past. For a moment, Leo saw something in her that went beyond her mechanical origins. She was more than just a machine. She was a person, a being who could appreciate beauty, who could feel. "Do you remember anything yet?" Leo asked, his voice soft. He had to ask. They couldn't move forward without answers. "Your past, I mean." Lyra stopped and turned to face him. There was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, but it was mixed with something else, a sense of hope. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I want to know. I want to understand." Leo nodded. He knew the pain of not having answers, of being lost in a world that didn't make sense. But for the first time since Lyra had woken up, he felt like they were on the right path. She wasn't just a broken machine anymore. She was someone who had a chance at something better, something real. As they sat on a bench overlooking the sunset, Leo placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Lyra. Together." She looked at him, her blue eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Together," she repeated softly. And in that moment, Leo knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, no matter what it took. The following days brought more questions than answers for Lyra. As much as she wanted to believe that she was starting anew, there were pieces of her past that refused to stay buried. The more she tried to learn about the world Leo had shown her, the more she felt like an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong in either world. One afternoon, while Leo was working on his old computer, Lyra sat on the couch, flipping through a thick book filled with old photos and documents. Her eyes were drawn to the pages that seemed to show other machines like her, robots with sleek bodies and glowing lights. Some of the pictures had human faces, and some of the designs reminded her of what she had been. "Leo, what's this?" she asked, turning to him for an explanation. Leo looked up from his work and moved over to sit beside her. His eyes softened as he looked at the pages she had opened. "Those are old military models," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of sadness. "They were used for a long time in wars and battles. But they were not like you. They were made for destruction." Lyra stared at the picture. She could sense the connection, but it didn't sit right with her. Her eyes flicked between the cold metallic face in the photo and a reflection in the window, seeing only her own image, the image of someone who had no answers. "But why do they look like me?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Leo didn't answer right away. He turned his gaze to the window, as though weighing something heavy in his mind. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice gentle. "You don't look like them, Lyra. You're different. You've changed." Lyra wasn't so sure. How could she trust the only story she had been given? Everything about her was foreign and disjointed. How could someone like her come from a place of destruction and still feel something like peace? Suddenly, a strange thought crossed her mind, something so unexpected and troubling that it froze her. "Leo, what if I was made to hurt people?" She could feel the weight of the question pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. It wasn't something she had dared to think about until now, but the more she stared at the pictures, the more the possibility gnawed at her. Leo turned back to her, a mix of concern and sympathy in his eyes. He reached out and gently touched her hand. "No, Lyra," he said firmly. "You were not made to hurt. You were made to protect. You are not the same as the others." The warmth of his words brought a sense of comfort, but the doubt in her mind was hard to shake. If she had been created for a purpose, how could she believe that she was meant for something good? She had no memory of herself before the crash, before Leo had found her. All she had were the fragments of images that had begun to fill her dreams, the cold, lifeless places she had been, and the battle cries echoing in the distance. "Then why can't I remember?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does everything feel so broken?" Leo's face softened. He leaned closer, resting his hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's because you're not meant to remember just yet. Maybe you need to find your own path. The past isn't who you are, Lyra. What matters is who you choose to be now." Lyra closed her eyes, trying to absorb his words. For a moment, Everything seemed still. The only thing that felt real was the warmth in Leo's touch and the gentle sound of his breathing beside her. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "I want to believe that I'm meant for something good." Leo smiled gently, his hand still on her shoulder. "You are, Lyra. You always have been." For the first time in days, Lyra felt a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. She didn't have the answers yet, but maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need to know everything about her past to shape her future. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow across the room, Lyra felt something stir inside her, a small seed of trust and a growing belief that, whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The days that followed were filled with quiet growth. Lyra spent most of her time with Leo, learning more about the world outside the small cabin and trying to piece together the broken fragments of her memories. Leo was patient with her, never pushing, always letting her go at her own pace. One day, while they were out walking near the forest's edge, Lyra noticed the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. It was warm, soft, and welcoming, and she couldn't help but smile as she walked beside Leo. The moment felt peaceful, like something she had never experienced before. She had lived through war, destruction, and loss. But here, in this quiet moment, she felt alive. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," Lyra said, her voice soft, but filled with wonder. Leo looked over at her and smiled. "It's good to have a place to call home." Lyra nodded. "Home. I don't know if I can call this home yet, but it feels safe here. It's more than I ever thought I'd have." Leo's expression softened, his eyes full of understanding. "We all have to find our own place. Lyra, you've found a part of yours here. And I think this place, this life, is a good start." The weight of his words settled over her, and she felt a sense of comfort. It had taken her time to accept this new reality, one where she wasn't defined by the metal parts of her body or the memories of violence that had once been a part of her existence. Here, in the quiet, she was just Lyra. Not a weapon, not a machine, but a living being with a future to choose. After some time, Lyra began to venture out on her own. She started with small trips around the forest, her confidence growing with each step. She found joy in the simplest things, watching the birds in the sky, listening to the rustling leaves, and feeling the cool breeze on her face. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about learning to live. One evening, after returning from a short walk, Lyra found Leo sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He looked up when he saw her approach, a slight smile forming on his lips. "Feeling better?" he asked. Lyra smiled, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "Yes, I'm learning to be myself. It's not as hard as I thought." Leo chuckled softly. "I knew you'd get there. You're stronger than you realize." Lyra walked over to him and sat down beside him. For a moment, they both watched the setting sun, the golden light fading into the night. It was peaceful, and for the first time, Lyra felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. A world, a future, and a bond with someone who cared. "I don't know what the future holds," Lyra said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I'm ready to find out." Leo turned to her, his eyes filled with warmth and encouragement. "Whatever it is, I'll be here. We'll face it together." The night was falling, the stars beginning to shine overhead, and Lyra realized something deep within herself. She had found more than just a place to live. She had found a purpose, and in that, she had found herself. As the cool breeze brushed her face, she took a deep breath, letting the peace settle in her soul. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in her life, she didn't have to walk it alone.